You're listening to a podcast by the Manchester Lit and Phil. In this episode, you'll hear an in-discussion event with Nazir Afzal, OBE, and Darryl Morris of Times Radio. This event took place at the Anthony Burgess Foundation in Manchester on the 30th of October 2023. Nazir Afzal was Chief Crown Prosecutor for North West England and former Director in London. Among many things, he was Chief Executive of the country's Police and Crime Commissioners and most recently, National Advisor to the Welsh Government. During a 30-year career, he has prosecuted the most high-profile cases in the country and advised on many others. Darryl Morris is an award-winning radio and TV presenter, currently hosting the weekend evening show on Times Radio. In this discussion, they touch on a variety of different arguments from what motivated Afzal to get into law, the state of the legal system in modern Britain, and some of the stories that helped shape this country, as witnessed firsthand from the prosecutor's office. So, without further ado, here are Nazir Afzal and Darryl Morris.
Nazir, welcome.
Good evening.
Thank you for being here.
Absolute delight.
Oh boy, what a challenge getting your life, your career, those incredible stories into
I've had to live it.
in 40 minutes. Yeah. I guess we should start at the beginning. Do you remember when the touch paper was lit that sparked your passion for law and justice?
Only when I was writing the book that Sue mentioned, I went back, as one does through their life, to try and understand where they came from. And those of us who are old enough and to remember the 60s and 70s, Darryl, there was an enormous amount of overt racism. My parents came here to UK in '61. They'd been spending a lot of time supporting the British Army in different parts of the world. And when we arrived, I was born in Birmingham, and that's only 20 miles from where Enoch Powell gave his speech on the Rivers of Blood. There was racism on the streets, I'd leave to go to school and come back with a Parker jacket that was covered in saliva, and none of it was mine. And that was the existence, I think, that we all got used to. And I remember being attacked by three young men, white men, who chased me down the street. And we got to be good runners, by the way, back then. And I ran, and there was a police officer, this is like the early 70s, police officer, and I'll never forget his words when he saw me running towards him: "What have you stolen?" There was me, the victim. And so I think there was a recognition that there were people like me, not just people of colour, people from working class backgrounds and others who just didn't have a voice, who weren't being listened to at all. And I think all of that played on my mind to the point where I didn't have any role models. I mean, there weren't any black or brown lawyers. I didn't know any lawyers. The only doctor I knew was the one who visited the GP. And I remember having a conversation with my dad about, I wanted to go and study law at university, and he just laughed at me and said, "Well, who are your role models?" And I had to think on my feet, and I said, Atticus Finch, Mahatma Gandhi, and Nelson Mandela, all three, of course, lawyers. And he said, one's fictional, the other one was murdered, and the third one's in prison. And those are all. I said, yeah, that's it. But I think the reason was simple. I think all of those people that I just mentioned and others, for them, law was just a tool. There are thousands of better lawyers than I am, but I recognized that law was a tool for delivering some change. And I think that was probably the conversation with my father and the earlier beating, I guess, that made me realize that perhaps that was the direction for my career.
Did you find, when you pursued it to education and you got into the system, did you find that there were obstacles?
Yeah, of course there are. I mean, I'm remembering now my 3 years in Birmingham, 4 because I was a student union vice president, and I was pretty much the only black or brown face in my faculty, on my course. Then when I went to law school in Guildford, well, I was pretty much the only black person in Guildford. never mind the College of Law. So yeah, I mean, I didn't have anybody around me that looked like me. But then again, strangely, I didn't feel conscious of it at that time. Largely, I think we were battered and bruised. So, my sense was, what's an obstacle? Something to get over. I had some good supporters, and I had people who I admired, and people who were around me who looked after me when needs be. Absolutely, the law is as racist as any other, sexist, misogynist, homophobic as any other profession, because society, it just reflects society. And I have no doubt whatsoever that I was looked at very differently because of who I was.
You worked privately for a while, didn't you? You worked as a defence solicitor in Birmingham.
Yep.
Before then and then you went into the public sector in 1990?
End of 1990. You had to do when you're qualifying as a lawyer, you had to do 3 areas of law. I did criminal law, and I enjoyed that tremendously, and I'd come home and I'd have lots to talk about. I did probate, and I had nothing to talk about. And corporate law, and I had even less to talk about. And so criminal law is the route I took down. I worked for a phenomenal firm of solicitors called Glazers in Birmingham. Some brilliant lawyers, Charles Royal and David Dollery, are two partners who took me under their wing and supported me. But it wasn't for me, Darryl, and there was one particular moment where I realised it wasn't for me. And I was sat this is 1990, 89, 90. Back then you didn't have video disclosures if you were a witness or if you're a victim of a sexual offence. And so what happens is a statement is taken from you. And so I'm sat with a suspect of a rape in a police station, and I'm ready to advise him. But as part of the advice, I have to read to him the statement of the alleged victim. And I'm reading the statement, and I realise he's getting off on it. And I thought, I don't want to be doing this. I want this bastard. I don't. Let's make it very clear that we all need defence lawyers. We need more of them. They need to have properly funded legal aid. But it wasn't for me. I would rather try and build a case against this guy rather than try and find a loophole or something to give him a defence. So I decided. It's almost like a running joke. I resigned that evening, and I saw the role. The Crown Prosecution Service was a brand new organisation. It was 3 years old. It gave me the opportunity to go to London, and there I was suddenly in April of 1990 as a baby prosecutor. That doesn't prosecute babies, by the way. Just junior prosecutor, the lowest rung in central London.
Wow. How did you find that institution in contrast to the private sector?
The way I describe it is that we were hated by everybody. A number of things. Firstly, when government sets something up, it never funds it properly. And so the Crown Prosecution Service in its infancy was losing files. This is pre-digital age, prehistoric age. So we were losing files and losing papers, and the media were jumping on that. Judges didn't like the fact that they wouldn't have a police sergeant in court anymore prosecuting. They had a lawyer. They didn't like us. Defence community didn't like us because we were taking their best lawyers or some of their lawyers. The police didn't like us because we'd taken on their role. The police now just investigated. They didn't prosecute. So we were disliked by everybody. And that was a good place to be. Because you know who your enemies are, which is everybody. But also, that presented a massive opportunity, Darryl, because I'm working in central London, in Victoria and central London. My courts are central London, the Old Bailey, Southwark Crown Court. I'm walking past what was then New Scotland Yard every day. And it gave me an opportunity to work on cases that I would never, ever, ever get. And also, back in the 90s, we didn't have something that is now the bane of our lives, and that's KPIs. So we had no key performance indicators. So go and make a mistake. Learn through your mistakes. Obviously, try not to make mistakes. But within 2 years, I'm prosecuting a serial killer. Now I can assure you that would not happen now. Quite rightly, probably. He was convicted, by the way. But the point is that I was able to do stuff that I wouldn't ordinarily get to do. I was able to try and make mistakes and learn from them. I was able also to try and build bridges with those people who didn't like us. So with the judiciary, most particularly with the police. Every day I'd walk past Scotland Yard. In the days that you could, I walked in, and I'd go upstairs to senior officers and say, look, I'm here to help you. Is there anything I can help you with? I don't want you to waste time on cases that are not going anywhere. I want to help you develop and build cases that will go somewhere. And that, the point about trust is you build it through relationships. You can't do it by email, and you can't, well, we didn't have email then, but you can't do it by phone. You've got to do it face to face. And so the opportunity presented itself for me to sit with very senior officers and help them build strong cases. And so the culture was one of learning. The culture was one of supporting each other, but also of delivering justice at a time when perhaps people were, even now, people weren't particularly happy that justice wasn't being delivered. And I didn't have somebody, well, not all the time, on my shoulder telling me I can't do that. So I was able to do what I wanted to do and work with people that I wanted to work with.
We'll come back to that shortly, because I'd really like your take on the modern justice system, and we'll get to that. I was trying to think of what story to ask you about that would sort of best sum up what you did and take us into all the different sort of corners of the justice system that you explored. There's one case in particular of Sophia, who was a victim of people trafficking, that I think really captures the legal system as was and what you did as a prosecutor. Can you tell us that story?
Absolutely. Probably the most difficult case, you would never have heard of it probably, unless you've read chapter 13, but it is probably the most difficult case we've ever had to deal with, and I certainly had to deal with. And if you think, just imagine the scenario. This young girl is brought to the country at the age of 9 with a passport that says she's 19 and waved through by customs, right? As if no questions asked. What's happened is that she's already been sold by her family. She suffers from significant learning difficulties. She's hard of hearing, not hard of hearing, she's completely deaf. She has no language skills. She is as vulnerable as you can probably imagine, but she's been sold by her family to this other family who are relatively wealthy to be their maid, in effect. And she ends up living with them in the cellar for 10 years. She's brutalized by the father of the family sexually. They also use her for labor, forced labor. She's making mobile phone covers and counterfeit T-shirts and stuff like this. They're abusing her by claiming disability allowance, which they then keep. Financially abused, physically abused, sexually abused, everything you can probably imagine. And yet nobody, and because she knew nobody, and also nobody was looking out for her, nobody cared, to put it bluntly. And then by chance, and it's always by chance, two trading standards officers went to the house because they were following up this counterfeit T-shirt and counterfeit mobile phone covers. And they noticed this young woman, she was 19 now, in the cellar and thought, this is a bit odd. And unlike everybody else, they didn't turn a blind eye. This is why I always say that safeguarding is everybody's business. Don't think it's the police's business. It's everybody's business. And they took her away and took her to a place of safety. But that's just the beginning, because we then had to, working with the local authority, which is Salford City Council, and also with every other agency we could think of, we taught her sign language. We had to deal with the trauma of what she had experienced and was going through. There's something new had been introduced back then called intermediaries, which is, so you ask me a question, I answer it, but some people won't understand the question. So the concept now is that you can have an intermediary in court or with you that will explain the question to you before you answer it. So we took advantage of intermediaries. We literally surrounded this young woman with everything that we could find to enable her to give evidence. And then we were very fortunate because we'd never charged anybody with internal trafficking. We'd never charged anybody with the offences that we did charge these people with. The family, and the trial lasted 6 months. Do you know why it lasted 6 months? It's because we persuaded the judge that she can only answer 4 questions a day. Does that give you an idea of how vulnerable she was? And so she gave evidence. Anybody here given evidence in a courtroom? She gave evidence for 46 days. Now, that's... Anyway, but we put everything around her to provide it. And eventually, after a 6-month trial, the family were convicted. And then that wasn't enough. Again, we never in this country had confiscated property from traffickers, and so we brought confiscation proceedings against the family, and we took £100,000 off them, which we then gave to her to enable her to rebuild her life, and she's now working in the nursing profession. So that young woman who couldn't speak, who couldn't hear, who had severe learning difficulties, who was being raped on a regular basis, who was living in a cellar, who was completely forgotten, can now add and contribute to the world that she's part of, and those who offended against her were brought to justice. And that's the power of a justice system. And you know, somebody asked me, and I never told anybody this, but that case cost us £2.5 million. I remember going to Pakistan doing some rule of law work and telling them that, and they said, that's our annual budget for everything. But there's no price, surely there should be no price on justice. And you know, the fact that it cost £2.5 million is because it did need that level of resource. But I'm immensely proud of it, and the outcome, of course, is, you know, the bad people are convicted, and this young woman has a life.
What is she doing today?
She's working in nursing.
Wow, incredible, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's just, you know, I've enormous testament to her and her courage, and to everybody else that surrounded her and supported her and continues to support her. But she was, you know, as I said, the most vulnerable person I've ever come across, ever. And she allowed us to change the law.
Well, that led to the Modern Slavery Act, didn't it? That case?
First prosecution amendments, absolutely all of that. Pre the Modern Slavery Act.
Yeah.
It led, I mean, I had a conversation with somebody you'll all know, Theresa May, and explained this to her, and within a couple of years we had the Modern Slavery Act. So, you know, if anything, it led to legislative change, it led to seismic change for victims and ultimately for perpetrators. So, you know, it's not just that case, it has an impact way beyond that case.
Would that conviction have come about today?
No, of course it wouldn't. We are, you know, we are in a really bad place, and I often use the term broken justice system because I can't think of another. You know, only last week our prison was full, 86,000 people. We haven't got a prison space. The government were telling prisons, can you please release some people so we can put some people in? They were telling judges, please don't sentence anybody this week. Got nowhere to put them. That's just the prison system. And then, of course, those who are in prison aren't getting rehabilitation. They're literally locked away for 23.5 hours a day. So those who could be rehabilitated aren't. So there's a revolving door. They come out and then they reoffend. Their addictions or all their issues aren't being addressed. Prosecutors are struggling. They don't have the resources. Police are struggling. Please don't buy into the we've got 20,000 new officers mantra. We lost 21,000 officers. And not only did we lose 21,000 officers, we lost 500,000 years of policing experience. You can't replace that with 20,000 newbies, however good they are. It'll be years before they get to that level of expertise and experience. It's not something you learn in a day or two. So we've lost it there. Probation services, struggling. All the support services, all the NGOs. I'm privileged patron of 9 NGOs, all women-led, and all of them are struggling to resource. They spend half their lives fundraising when they could spend 100% of their time helping people. You know, so there is probably no element of our system, Darryl, that is on its feet. All of it is crushed, and you know, I fear for justice. I fear for you victims. I fear for us as a society when perpetrators are not being brought to justice. You know, if you, God forbid, are a victim of a serious crime tomorrow, it could be 2.5 years before that case comes to trial. If it comes to trial. I mean, I don't know how we got to, I know how we got here. I don't know how we get out of here.
How did we get here?
We took resources out of it. We treated it as if it was an easy department to cut, or easy departments to cut. And you know, they also, I mean, they need to be blamed as well. The public services that I was part of are not very good at singing their praises, but also not very good at calling out stuff. Even me, when I was a prosecutor, I was never allowed to criticize the government of the day. I mean, that's just not done, but even their leaders weren't. So unless you call it out, unless you, the public, are aware of what's happening, you're not going to march on Downing Street or whatever to say, don't do that. Because you don't know what's happening and you don't know what's aware of. So all the resources, lack of resources, from 2010 onwards, we've been going downhill, and from 2015 onwards, we've been skidding downhill.
We'll come back to that point as well in more detail shortly. I just want to bounce on to another really high-profile case that you had, a career and probably actually life-defining case that you were a part of, and that was the Rochdale grooming gangs. Yeah. Well documented, of course, that story. You've talked about the personal toll that took on you prosecuting the Rochdale grooming gangs. In what sense?
Because it's not, people don't know. We don't talk about ourselves as human beings. Let me just backtrack a little bit, Darryl. In 2006, I prosecuted a group of extremists just before they began blowing things up. So this was before they became terrorists. And I got a visit from Special Branch, turning up at my office in London and saying, Nazir, we're here to tell you we found your name on an Al-Qaeda hit list. And I said to the officers, well, thanks, what now? They said, no, that's just our legal duty to tell you. So that's very kind, thank you. That's very kind, thank you so much. And literally, I sent my family away for a week to take stock, and I couldn't think of what to do. So anyway, they came back, and I lived with it. I realized there were consequences to leadership. Thankfully, I'm still here. Anyway, but when the grooming gang case was when they were convicted in May 2012, there was an extraordinary outpouring. People suddenly realized that child sexual abuse was happening, as if, they were completely blinkered until then, seemingly. I always make the point, the vast majority, 2/3 of all sexual abuse of children happens in the family, or people who know each other, acquaintances. The next largest group of victims are online. Right now, for pennies, you can watch a child being sexually abused for you. The third largest group of victims of child sexual abuse are institutional victims. So, places of worship, schools, colleges, BBC, ITV, you name it. Anywhere where you can think children might ordinarily be safe. Street grooming of the type in the Rochdale case is actually, even though it's thousands of victims, it's the smallest group, but the one that was getting all the attention. And I was doing lots of media in May 2012, trying to explain to people that the issue wasn't, the ethnicity of the men was an issue, but it wasn't the issue. The issue was that there was 47 young girls in that particular case who had never been listened to, who we had treated with disdain, who we had said to them, your voice and your lives don't matter. And they had traumatic family backgrounds, or they had addiction issues, or low-level criminality, and we treated them like they were nothing. And that was the point I was making over and over again. I even got a phone call from somebody called David Cameron, remember him? And I explained to him, this is what it's about. As a society, we're ignoring victims, and particularly victims from these types of vulnerable backgrounds. And because I was doing all of this, suddenly the far right woke up. Far right had been making a big deal about the case because of the ethnicity of the perpetrators. And then they realized, this is the BNP at that time, they realized that I damaged their narrative. Their narrative is that all brown people are the rapists. When it became obvious that public people became aware that I was the one to prosecute these guys when other people didn't want to prosecute them, suddenly I damaged their narrative. And they didn't like that. And so this is 2012, I never heard the concept of fake news back then. But suddenly they put stuff on Facebook and social media to tell their members or their followers that I was the one that hadn't prosecuted these guys. Despite, this is light telling you, dark telling you light. It's the exact opposite of the truth. But their followers believed it. And so before you knew it, or before I knew it, I had far-right thugs trying to break into my house. I had to have a police officer outside of my front door for 2 weeks. I'd tell my kids who were early teens at the time, the Prime Minister's got a police officer outside his door. It was the only way I could provide reassurance. I had to have panic alarms placed in all of my rooms. and teach a 9-year-old boy how to use a panic alarm in case we're attacked again. They could only go to school in taxis for 4 months because that was security advice I was given. I got 17,000 letters and emails to my teams around the country calling for me to be sacked and deported. Now, I was born in Birmingham, I love the place, but I don't want to go back there. You know? Right? Right? But they came brutally close to destroying me. Literally. I mean, I can't begin to tell you how. And I'd got every decision right in the case, and yet they came that close to destroying me. And it was only because of my colour. If I'd been Darryl, or John Smith, or Peter Hilton, whatever it is, if I'd been that, they would have been celebrating you on your carrying you around the streets of Rochdale or Greater Manchester or the UK on your shoulders. But because I was Nazir Afzal and I was brown, destroy him. He damages our narrative. And it was only 3 things, actually, that prevented me from going down. I'm not over-egging it here. I was desperately close to quitting. 3 things. One was the people around me, my network, my family, my staff. They were phenomenal. I still remember my PA running down the corridor with a letter that contained feces saying, "Don't tell him, don't tell him." You know, they kept the worst excesses away from me. Then there was my boss. I hadn't realized it at the time, but my boss had told my staff, don't make any meetings for Nazir between 9 and 10 a.m. and 3 and 4 p.m. because he needs to be available to do the school run. Do not invite him to any national conferences or meetings because he needs to be at home to provide reassurance to his family. I was wondering why I wasn't being invited to it. But that man knew that I needed something that I wasn't asking for. By the way, his name's Keir Starmer, I don't know if you've heard of him. Right? And the third thing that kept me going was there were other victims. If these 47 girls had suffered as they had done, what about the thousands of others? How many other cases have we got wrong that we need to revisit? So all of those things together made me realize I still had a job to do.
Incredible. Quite right. When that moment comes, when the verdict arrives, not just in the Rochdale case, but in Sophia's case, these cases that you have invested an enormous amount of time and emotional energy into, how does that feel?
Do you know, there's no excitement in it. When you watch it on the TV or the movies or something, there's almost like fireworks go off or something, you know. There's not, because it's not joyful, it's a job done. When I prosecuted, best example I give of that is, there was a young Salford boy called Anuj Bidve, who was Indian student who was here in 2011, and he was shot dead on Boxing Day by a gangster on his way to the sales. 6 months later, he came to this country. His mum and dad raised £30,000 for him to study in the UK. 3 months in, he's dead. The next thing they do is bring him home. At the trial at Manchester Crown, mum and dad are there, and the killer is convicted. And the mother comes up to me and holds my hand and says, "Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you." And I'm just crying, thinking, why are you thanking me? You've lost everything. And the 2 things, one thing that flew from that was realizing that, yeah, it was important to deliver that, it was important for her to see that. But secondly, we then had a conversation with the Indian government and we got them their £30,000 back. You know, it's a small thing. But there's no joy in that. It's just a job done. But people do need, for some people, that's closure. For some people, seeing a conviction is closure. For others, I learned this from the Stuart Hall case. You all remember Stuart Hall? He was convicted of the abuse of 11 women and girls and not guilty of the abuse of 1. And I went to see this woman who was in her 30s, and I said to her, "I'm really sorry that I couldn't give you closure." And she looked me in the eye and said, "Nazir, you gave me closure the moment you believed me." And I realized I was so fixated on process, arrest, charge, sentence, conviction, sentence. What was most important for her was that somebody listened and believed. And so that's another lesson one learns from all of this, is that it's not about, people will receive something from everything, it starts though with somebody sitting down with you and believing what you have to say. and then investigating it, and then prosecuting it if needs be. And so, to my mind, there is no joy in the conviction. You know, I've been to prison many times as part of my role. It wasn't part of my role, but I thought it was important for me to go around prisons now and again and to understand from prison officers and whatever it is that their issues were. I'd be going into a prison and seeing people. At one point, about 2013, half of Strangeways I'd put there, right? Right? When I'm in there and I'm approached by some prisoners, I don't know what to think. But they know I'm just doing my job. You know, it's not. We're not an oppressive country. We follow evidence and the jury determines guilt, etc. etc. So actually, I didn't see it as being me against them. You know, so there is no joy in it. There is just the need to do a professional job and to ensure that people are heard.
Quite right as well, yeah. Two people appreciate that. That's good. That's all right, take what you can get. You see the best of people. Mm. You see people at their most vulnerable. You also see the worst of humanity. What kind of toll does that take on you? What does that do to your faith in people in general?
I have enormous faith in people. But yeah, I've seen the worst of humanity, but I've seen the best of people. I've seen courageous victims. I've seen witnesses who've stood up. I've seen people who've challenged the status quo. I've seen people who will not take no for an answer and persist in a campaign to change the way things are done. You know, whether it's Clare's Law or whatever it may be. People are determined to turn terrible events into good. But yet the worst of humanity, I don't know if this ended up in the book. I don't know if it did, but in 1997, 98, but forgive me if I trigger, my apologies for doing so, but it just reminds me of something. I was first contact for the Paedophile Union, New Scotland Yard. Now, that was a job they gave me. They gave me a role. And they said, yeah, you can be our first contact, because we build a relationship. And this is the year of camcorders. Remember camcorders? And there was a case in which a mother had used a camcorder to film her father, the husband, raping an 18-month-old baby. And to prepare for the case, I have to look at the evidence because I've got to satisfy myself that she's not acting under duress. Otherwise, I wouldn't prosecute her. So I'm watching this, and at that time I had an 18-month-old daughter. I watched it, I went home, and I hugged her tightly, and I realized that I didn't have a job anymore, I had a mission. The reality is that it's people's experiences or people's the terror of the people have experienced that has enabled me to do something for them or try and do something for them. Working in teams, phenomenal teams of people that I've worked with over the last 25, 30 years. But I don't see, I've seen the worst that humanity can do to each other, and absolutely, but at the same time, I've seen the best, and I think the best always outnumbers the worst. And at the same time, I'm really touched, even when I'm talking to victims of most horrific abuse, they're still human. And they're more human, actually, seemingly. And they will begin their recovery. And I often use this story, and again, please forgive me for sharing it with you. About a year and a half ago, I've got the most rubbish, shittiest website known to man. But I haven't updated it for 3 years. It just has my Twitter feed or whatever it's called these days. But it has a contact page, and I get contacted every day, Darryl. Dozens of people contact me because they're suffering. And I'm not Batman. I can't help them all. I will signpost where I can. But there was one particular email I got 18 months ago, and it said this. It said, "Dear Mr. Afzal, you won't remember me. I was one of the victims of Stuart Hall. I now have terminal cancer. I only have a few weeks to live, but I want you to know that my life began when you gave me justice." And I got this email, and I thought for a couple of days, I'm thinking, what do I do? I can't just say thank you. That doesn't do it, does it? So I sent her my number, and she kindly rang me up, and she explained that for 30 odd years since the abuse had happened, nobody believed her. She'd been blamed for everything. She'd been re-traumatized, And suddenly, when she was able to get justice in 2013, she could begin her life. And here she was at the end of her life, telling me that that's the impact that what we did had on her. And she said to me, and she used these words, "You changed my life." And a few weeks later, she passed. And I don't do this routinely, but I went to her funeral. This is a woman who I'd never met before. She was a name on a statement. You know, she didn't have to give evidence in the trial. I'd never met her. I'm now at her funeral, and I'm asking myself, why am I here? And I realized when she said that she had changed, or I had changed her life, I wanted her to know that she had changed mine. And that's the power of humanity, is that, you know, the bad stuff is a lot of bad stuff, and it's still happening, and it will continue to happen. But the good things that people do and the impact. Who was it said, you know, that it's not about what you do, it's about how you make people feel? Was it Maya Angelou? I can't remember who it was. But that's the reality, is that we should be concerned about our impact, not just the job that we do, the impact we have on people. And the people have really touched me. I'm privileged in the fact that they share their stories with me.
I'm sure. How do we fix the system?
I'm not going to get party political here, but we have the worst Home Secretary in 25 years. You know, I've worked with 10 of them, and the best, strangely, was Dominic Grieve, who was, you know, the last but one Conservative one. We've got a government that doesn't really, their focus is entirely on sentencing. It's great when you've got prisons with space in them, and also great if you can arrest people first, convict them second, and sentence them. So they are focused on the end of a process where the beginning is completely flawed. So we start, you know, I don't know if there are any former police officers in the room here. Some of them should be back in the job, you know, providing advice, support, because they've got enormous experience. Providing support, mentoring, supporting the new officers that are in the system. The same, I don't want to do this myself, by the way, any prosecutors out here, I'm not coming back. You know, but, you know, similarly, there'll be chief prosecutors, ex-prosecutors can do the same. Bring the experience back in. Bring the experience back in. Also, the capacity to deal with cases needs to improve. There are thousands of courtrooms that are empty because there aren't enough judges or magistrates or staff, etc., etc. I think we should treat this as the emergency that it is and reopen many of those courtrooms and get cases processing through the system much, much faster than they currently are. And we need to fund probation services. We need to fund the rehabilitative services. But also, this government is doing nothing about prevention. You know, I don't see stuff happening in the addiction sphere. I don't see stuff happening in, you know, they talk about stop shoplifting. They're not addressing why people might want to shoplift or need to shoplift, you know? So let's put some more effort into the sort of preventative sphere before people get into a system that can't deliver justice.
Keir Starmer, as you say, was your boss?
Yeah, was
your boss. What sort of Prime Minister would he make?
You have to ask him that. As I said, I speak from working with him 5 years. You know, now and again I'll speak to him, very, very rarely. And at the end of the day, I can go on. I just go on what I know from the 5 years. I've given you one example. I'll give you another example. Is that he spent all of his time on the road. You know, he didn't want to hang around in London headquarters. He was in Carlisle, he was in Preston, he was in Cardiff, he was in Middlesbrough. He was literally on the road, engaging with staff, engaging with communities, because he like me understood that you're nothing without those relationships. You're nothing without public confidence. You're nothing without trust. And the other thing, which, you know, I have a problem with politicians generally, you know, is that truth and integrity. He had tons of it back then. I hope that's not going to be diluted as time goes on.
When you see him perform and you see him at work now, is he a different person to how he was when you worked with him?
Absolutely. Of course he is. I mean, he's a politician now. And he's surrounded by people who will tell him to say this and that and the other, rather than just saying what he believes. Very early on, literally a month into his role as DPP, I'm in London, he invites me to come along with him to a school. And I'm thinking he wants me to go along and talk to these students about the role of the prosecutor, etc., etc. And it was a bloody primary school. Those kids didn't know what right and wrong was. Literally, it was that level. And it was him wanting to learn from me to an audience of 7-year-olds of what my job was. Because you do speak differently to an audience of 7, 8-year-olds. And that was him trying to understand what I did, what he was in charge of now at that time. And I think I hope that remains. That needs to be reinvigorated. The fact that it's a service. The word public service. I used to start all of my speeches with, I am your servant, right? He is our servant. And they must all politicians must stop thinking that they rule us. So I just hope that he gets back in touch with the Keir Starmer of 2010.
Politics. We're going to take some questions, by the way, in a moment. So just have a quick think now, and we'll get some questions in a moment. I just want to ask you finally. You talk about public service. You talk about integrity. You've got a huge amount of experience. Those are all things that would be very welcome in the House of Commons.
Yeah, right.
You fancy it?
No. It's not a secret. I have been asked several times over the last few years, and I've answered. Was it Groucho Marx that said he wouldn't want to be a member of a club that would have him? And it's very similar to what Groucho. No, I have no time for that. I think you can achieve far, far more. All of us can, in our jobs, in our lives, in our communities, in society. I feel, yes, I've changed laws and I've changed things, but I did that not by being a politician. I did that because I did it in my roles, or I did it as an activist, or I did it by listening to people and acting upon what they tell me. And I don't think, the idea of being a politician, it doesn't even enter my head.
But you said that a lot of the problems in the justice system root back to government, home secretaries, that body of power. Would it not make sense then for you to be in that?
No, I think I can tell them what to do. And I can scream and shout. And I know, and you will all know, if you're a member of parliament, in whichever party you're in, you can't say what you really want to say. The word whip comes to mind. You are whipped. So it doesn't matter how phenomenal your great ideas are. And I know, I've got about 400 MPs that follow me on Twitter, by the way, right? And that's 400 of them who will not say a diddly squat about what they actually really think. And I couldn't do that as a member of parliament. I literally am privileged and honoured right now that I don't owe my allegiance to anything or anybody. I can say what I like, and that I will protect at all costs.
Nicely said.